Good evening. We continue our series on creation versus evolution. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork. We are discovering what wondrous evidences exist for the existence of God and for His glory. We are also considering what the opposition has to say. We are looking at evolution and the associated evidences, the arguments that are made. We are discerning what is true from what is false. Where does science truly lead? Does it lead to God or does it lead away from Him? We are doing this so that, as I discussed early in the class, if we understand the opposition, then we have a better chance of winning the victory. And our goal here, obviously, is to evangelize those around us. There are people who don't believe in God, who believe in a natural causation to the universe, to life. As Christians, we are charged to reach out to them just as well as anyone else, even those who would have a belief in some type of God. But those who do not require our attention as well. And sometimes we have to go into a little different type of study to get us on the same page. We want to have common ground. The existence of God and His Word being authoritative are the most basic of common grounds that we must have if we're going to evangelize. Over the course of this lesson, we have broken down the theory of evolution into parts. As a whole, it can be intimidating, but when we break it down into parts and we see the basic evidences that were used to develop these pieces, we see that it's not so intimidating, and that these evidences, some may be true, some are false doctrine, but in every case it does not dissuade from the idea of the existence of God. We are also going to describe the common points of debate. So if you've listened to debates between creationists and evolution, you'll hear these themes very often, and there's a reason that they exist. We are talking about the existence of God and our response to that. It's a big deal. And there are, a lot of people spend a lot of time and effort delving deep into theories and concepts that prove, or in the case of evolution, would try to disprove the existence of God. And so that's what we're talking about now. Last week we talked about time. I actually spent the whole class on time. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot that could be said. At this point, I would also encourage you to leave comments to these videos. If you have questions, would request a further explanation, give me some time to look into it, give an adequate explanation as best that I can. Obviously, I'm no expert, but I will do my best to try to find a good resolution to these questions, and we will do that as our last class, assuming we do have some questions and thoughts, clarifications, that kind of thing. Please do leave those in the comments. You could also reach out to me individually. We're moving on. The next point of debate that we're going to talk about is a concept of irreducible complexity. That's a big name. It sounds irreducibly complex in and of itself. So let's describe what this is. Irreducible complexity. There are things that have complexity, that are highly functioning, have a purpose that in a simpler form, a reduced form, no longer have that same function, no longer have that same purpose. Complex mechanism, which can have no function in a reduced state. Now, that's not entirely correct. I said have no function. Does not have a valuable or similar function in a reduced state. See, the way that evolution is supposed to work, as we've discussed in micro and macro evolution, the idea that evolution, things move slowly over time and it builds on itself. It takes something very basic and it puts a little adaptation. It has a little more complexity, adds a little bit. And of course, evolution would claim that it does this by mutation. We talked a lot about that. But according to evolution, you have something very basic. Let's think about the ability to see. I mean, we start off with these little light-sensing nodes, right? Not necessarily we, but the way evolution would work in an organism. You start off with light-sensing nodes, and then you have a mutation, and now you have developed more proteins and have different function, and now you can have the ability to see depth. And then you have another mutation. Now you have the ability to see color. It's adding more potential for evolution to work on, to pass down to the next generation and perpetuate into the population. The problem is that this argument suggests that there are things that are very complex, that are very high functioning, that could not have developed in that stepwise fashion. Evolution, when you have a mutation, let's talk about it in the terms of you have a new idea. So according to evolution, the genetic mutation produces a new idea. It's either a good idea or a bad idea. If it's a bad idea, it gets thrown away, and by means that is not passed down to the next generation because the organism who had that mutation dies or is unable to pass it on to the next generation. So if you have a bad idea, it gets thrown away. If you have a good idea, it makes you more fit, it makes you more likely to procreate, then that's going to be a basis to build on. It's going to be passed down to the next generation, and new mutations or new good ideas are going to build on it little by little by little by little. That's the idea of how evolution works. But if you have something that could not have developed in a stepwise fashion, it's not like it retained a similar function and it built on it and made it more complicated, more complicated, more complicated. It's either take it or leave it. Well, we have a major problem with that process of evolution. And so that's the purpose behind what irreducible complexity is about. It is a Christian evidence argument saying that evolution doesn't make sense. We see these things all around us that function at in such a high purposeful manner that it's either take it or leave it. It functions the way it does, or it doesn't. Either doesn't function at all, or it has nothing compared. It's not in the same category as the function that it had. Now, the thought experiment that's used to describe this is the mousetrap. So if you imagine in your mind what the mousetrap is, it has a few components. It has the base, it has a spring, it has a latch, it has the mechanism that traps the mouse, and you have the cheese, the platform for the cheese to go on. Now, if you think about it, if you've ever tried to catch a mouse, that's very difficult to do. The ability to catch or to kill a mouse is a very fancy, high function. It's a difficult task to complete. So the fact that this mechanism can catch a mouse is a big, big fancy function. So as a thought experiment, the proponents of irreducible complexity will say that if imagine in your mind that the mousetrap is a living organism that has evolved over time, and it has this great function to be able to catch a mouse. Now, if it has gotten to this point with all these pieces put together, well, it had to develop to that point, right? According to evolution, if we apply the laws to evolution, it started with something basic, and it added on and added on and added on until it has this now highly functioning ability to catch a mouse. The problem is that if we consider the mousetrap as it is as the last evolutionary step, well, what was it like one step back? Before this last evolutionary step, what function would it have had in a reduced state? Now, if you imagine in your mind that mousetrap, take a look at that picture, look at any component on that mousetrap, and imagine that a step back in the evolutionary history of the mousetrap, that component does not exist yet. What function can it have? Can't catch a mouse anymore. So, according to this argument, there's no reason for the rest of it to have evolved without the in-game function of catching a mouse. In the case of the eye, as I said, at least, starting with the ability to light sense as a basis, and then depth perception, and then color, it's building on the same type of function, just getting better at it. In this case, when we're talking about irreducible complexity, we are losing the whole point of the mechanism by going back one evolutionary step. You take away the base, nothing can attach to it. It's just a pile of metal and cheese. You take away the spring, then it can't trap the mouse. It'll just sit there. It'll feed the mouse. You can use it to prop open a door or lift up a table or as a paperclip. And that actually is the ridiculous argument that is made by evolutionists in response to this. It says, well, it's the last one. Irreducible form could have a rudimentary function. So theoretically, if I had this mouse trap and I took away a piece and it can't catch a mouse anymore, the evolutionists will say, well, it could be a doorstop. It could be a paperweight. Could it keep a table from wobbling? It has a reduced function. But the complexity, the refined nature of the function is not in the same category. From being able to catch a mouse to a paperweight or a doorstop, is that really a function that there's a reason for it to have developed? Now, obviously, this is an inanimate object, the mousetrap. This is only used as a thought experiment. So let's make this more realistic. Let's look in biology. What do we actually see that fits the idea of irreducible complexity? Let's look at the bacteria flagellum. This is an amazing thing. Matter of fact, all through cellular biology, if you ever watch some videos, they got great animations. You can find on YouTube things like that, descriptions, lectures about the amazing technical, complex nature of these devices within cells, bacteria, our cells, the way things work, like factories and motors and all that. It's amazing what this stuff can do. Very complex. And in the case of the bacteria flagellum, you actually have an electric engine that is turning with gears and spans the cell wall. It has these brackets and rotors and uses ion channels with sodium and potassium and chloride to go back and forth to turn this engine as the moving force. And then it has this flagella that comes off the back that, because of the rotation of this biological electric engine, it rotates, and now the bacteria can swim through a medium. So one thing that's interesting about this is that we look and see, okay, this, according to evolution, has evolved. This isn't like the mousetrap. It's not a thought experiment. This is legitimate. This is something that they would claim has to have developed. Now, we see it as a product of creation. We would see this as an intelligently designed mechanism. But according to evolution, this has evolved in a stepwise fashion, piece by piece by piece. The problem is that if you take away a piece, if you reduce this mechanism by one step, one evolutionary step, the one step less evolved version of this flagella, it no longer swims. Now, swimming for the bacteria is a very refined function. It's big purpose. So without that functionality, what is it good for? Well, you could say that it could serve as a hole in the cell wall that things can move through, like a port. If it didn't turn but it had the flagellum, perhaps they could say, well, it could be something that could stick to stuff. You could grab onto things with this flagellum because it was sticky or something. I don't know what the arguments are for the little pieces left over. The point is that these complex mechanisms in a reduced form do not have anything close to the obviously designed purpose for them. And because of that, there's no reason, evolutionarily speaking, for it have to develop piece by piece in a stepwise function process without that end result being in view. And of course, biological processes don't have the foresight ability. They can't see into the future and say, eventually I'm going to need to be able to swim, so I'm going to build pieces of this electric engine that's not really going to be able to help me swim, but I'll push stuff through it in the meantime. And then at the end, when I get the flagellum on there, now I can swim. There's no thought process to biological engines. There is in intelligent design, and this is obviously what it points us to. But these things cannot have developed in a stepwise fashion. Now, the other argument is a little more complex. The evolutionary answer is the idea that the more reduced forms, the forms that don't have as much functionality, well, they could have been co-inherited with another more evolutionarily fit gene. And what that means is that when you pass down your genes from generation to generation, of course, you have your strand of DNA. And let's say that the gene that we're talking about for the flagella, it's not a swimming electric engine with a tail on it. quite yet. It's a reduced version of that. It's just a gear, opening, makes a protein that makes an opening in the cell wall. So normally this by itself is not a very high functioning thing and would probably in the scheme of evolution be thrown into the trash. So why wasn't it thrown into the trash? Why did it even build upon this basic component if it didn't have foresight into the eventual function that it could potentially have? Well, they'll say that maybe it was very close on the DNA strand to something that was very important. And because that important gene, by evolutionary selection, was passed on from generation to generation, that this other gene just kind of snuck by under the radar, building on itself, building on itself, building on itself, until it developed into something very high functioning. Of course, we can see this is a stretch. This is a big stretch, and it's quite ridiculous. And it goes against the rules set up by evolution about how things develop and how things work. So we can see both of these rebuttals are relatively ridiculous. A reduced form could have some rudimentary function. There's a paperweight is nothing like catching a mouse. A hole in your cell wall is nothing like being able to swim. There's no true reason for these things to have developed naturally. These are designs. This is intelligence at work. And this is actually the bacterial flagella. If you look very closely at it and all these components, this is still very basic in regards to how complex life is and the pieces and how things work. Textbooks are filled, libraries are filled with textbooks full of information, the details of how life works, the mechanisms, the engines, the motors, the proteins, the structure, how things move, how things interact. It is amazing, and it is obviously intelligent design. It has a complexity that cannot be reduced and simplified in a stepwise fashion that can be attributed to a natural process. Our next point of debate that we're going to talk about is Noah's flood. Of course, people talk about Noah's flood, and if you talk to someone who believes in evolution, they use this as mockery. They believe that it is a joke that anyone could believe in the literal Noah's flood. Some of the things they raise is that the number of species, we've mentioned this before in the series, that I forget the number now, but there's a great number of species currently identified, and most likely there were more species that in the past, because some have died off and have gone extinct. And there's so many species that there's no way that 2 of every species on the boat would fit. Well, luckily that's not what the Bible talks about. The Bible talks about bringing on animals in kinds, general categories. And we did talk about the genetic potential, microevolution, which actually does exist. And we see it must exist to fit the paradigm of Noah's flood. We see that there were likely grandfather animals that had the genetic potential that in their generations to come, given different environments, could form different features, appearances that makes them more fit to live in those environments. That capability, that potential is built in. So that's our answer to the number of species questions. Now, if you boil it back down to kinds of animals, then it becomes much more likely and possible to have had a representation of life on the ark in the dimensions mentioned in the Bible. How about the quantity of fossils, coal, and oil? We're pumping oil out of the seabed, out of land, the natural gas, coal. Where these things came from, organic forms at some point. Now, when we think about dinosaurs being oil, well, that's really kind of a misconception. The majority of these fossil fuels are not from large organisms. They're from things like plankton and algae and things that actually, in the form of biomass, produce way, way more biomass than individual animals do. So it's really the settling of these biomasses that these things dying off over time, creating this bulk that is compressed, this organic material compressed over time, producing coal, oil, and fossils. So the response how do we have so much of this? I mean, we're pumping loads of oil out. Coal is unbelievable. And if you try to, calculate back how many organisms or what's the biomass that could develop a lump of coal, and then how many organisms would you have to have over how long a period of time in order to have the stores that the earth seems to have? Well, if you did that, you would see that, there's a lot of biomass required. And one could say at the level of population of animals and plants that we see today, 7 years doesn't cut it. Well, there's a couple of responses to that. For one, why do we the apparent age? Let's talk about that. Why do we think that the concentration of life that we see on Earth today is the same that it was in creation? We don't really know what the concentration of life was then, but it could be very well teeming with life. I mean, just filled to the brim. The potential of the earth is not even close to being filled with the capacity to sustain life. If we thought that perhaps in creation that the maximum potential that could be ecologically supported in equilibrium, sustainable on the earth, existed during creation from that time all the way up to the flood, then perhaps we could get a little closer to those numbers. Also with apparent age, how many rings did the first tree have? That was the thought question we posed. Could we also propose the idea that there's the possibility that the earth was created with coal and oil in it? Well, you say, well, it comes from animals. It has to be the product of animals, not necessarily animals, but biomass. I said mostly algae and things like that in the ocean, plankton and stuff like that. Would that not be deceitful? Well, no. Creation was done in a way that was functional, that accomplished the purpose that God had for it, to bring Him glory, to sustain life. And we certainly have purpose for coal and oil to develop. It's led to great innovations in our ability to communicate and to travel and to things like this. I'm not claiming this as, this is what God's had in His mind, but I'm saying there is the potential there for the idea that the earth was created with some of this in it because it has purpose, it has function, and we took advantage of it. Just like the stars in the sky, it may seem gratuitous, the amount of stars and the galaxies out there, but it does glorify God, and it had a purpose, so we could see them. It fulfills its purpose. Our universe, our world was created in a mature form, in a functional form. And then we have the idea, where did the water come from, and where did it go? Have you ever thought about this? Where did that water come from, and where did it go? Well, I'm not going to necessarily endorse this as the divinely inspired answer here. However, I did come across this through study of creationist writings and texts and debates, this hydroplate theory, which I thought was very interesting. And I would suggest, recommend that it'd be a good idea, if you wanted to go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this link provided and watch this video. It's a little, old-timey in its production value, but it's a very interesting concept, and it matches up with some of the things that we see in the Bible. If you'd like to do that, go ahead and click on that link. You can pause the video, and I'm going to go ahead and describe a little bit about that video and what it talks about and how this could explain what we see with the water, what we see in the formation of different features on Earth. So, assuming whether or not you've done that, let's go ahead and talk about it. So this video is describes a theory, has some animations in it, and it suggests that there was a layer of water under the crust of the earth. There's still water under the crust of the earth, by the way, salt water in pockets under the crust in places. But let's imagine that the entire earth had a layer of water under the crust, which could be discerned also from Scripture when it talks about where heavens and water and different layers and stuff like that. I won't get into all that now. I think it talks about it some in the video, perhaps. But that water under the crust of the earth would be under immense pressure with the weight of the land on top of it. So we can imagine if we take the water from the oceans, and let's say that most of that was under the land to begin with, a layer of water under the surface, and something happened, a crack, a break in that barrier, that water is going to come shooting out with a lot of pressure, a lot of force, a lot of energy. And if you've ever seen, had a water balloon full of water, and you watch it on YouTube with slow motion camera, and they stick it with a pin, and because that water is under pressure, and that the skin of that balloon, you can't see it with the naked eye, but with a time-lapse camera you can, where it starts splitting down the middle, the area, the path of least resistance, and that water comes rushing out. Now what's interesting is that you can see that the mid-oceanic ridge goes down the middle of the ocean, well, not so much in the Pacific, but you see that mid-oceanic ridge. Now, what's interesting about the the ridge is that the material there is consistent with the material under the crust. What actually is happening, now they call it, they talk about it in science as sublimation, but what's happening is that you have the crust on top, and then underneath you have a different composition of material, the mantle. So what you see with that mid-oceanic ridge is it has turned up. The mantle has turned up, and the crust on the top has moved aside and turned up. It looks like the seams of a baseball. And that material is from something underneath the top part, which means something has ruptured it, something has opened this up. We can also imagine that if the crust was laying on a layer of water, and there was water spouting out of a break going down a line, as we see in that oceanic ridge, it's going to put pressure on those land masses on either side away from where that water is coming out. All the land is connected. I mean, if you even go into the ocean, if you go down to the bottom of the ocean, guess what? There's land down there too. There's no open gaps that we can move land around and it's not going to run into itself. And it's actually the crust is all continual. There are cracks and there are plates. Yes, that's true. But there's not a gap of area that can be filled with land. So what happens when you have land that's all connected and you're putting pressure on the land from other directions? Well, if you think about, as an example, a piece of paper flat on a desk, and I would encourage you to do this at home. Of course, you can imagine in your mind very simply, put a piece of paper on a table, and you take your hand on both sides of it and push it together. What's going to happen? It's going to ripple, it's going to bend. Have you never noticed that the mid-oceanic ridges parallel the mountain ranges? So we can imagine if land is moving away from this point of rupture, but it's got resistance, that the land starts rippling, mountains and valleys being formed, parallel to where the rip is occurring. So this is obviously just a theory. There's a lot of individual evidences, the concentration of the materials, the salinity of water in different locations, the pockets of water still under the crust. There's a lot of things that point to this being a very good and legitimate theory. This is not scripture. This is not divinely inspired. However, I would say that this theory does line up with some things we do see in Scripture. We read in Genesis 7, chapter 11, about the fountains of the deep opening up during the time of the flood. So I would propose that perhaps maybe this theory doesn't have everything right. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But the Bible does speak about water coming from under the earth. So where did the water come from in response to that question from atheists? Well, it came from under the earth, a lot of it. Some of it came in the form of rain, we saw, but some of it came from under the earth. And where is that water today that covered the earth? It's still there. It's our oceans. There's a lot of it. Have you ever gone to the beach or on a boat out, deep sea fishing or something like that, out on the water? Man, it's amazing to look at, over the tops of the waves, how much water is out there. Man, it's a lot of water. And that's only the top part of it. It goes down, far down into the bottom of the ocean. That's a lot of water. So, according to the biblical stories, or the historical record in the Bible, the whole earth was covered with water, but currently we're holding all that water in basins called the ocean, and there's land sticking above it. Well, that's where this hydroplate theory comes in as a proposed explanation to that, is that you have land as it's being forced together rising and some land falling. A flood and the rising of land is a great explanation for things like the Grand Canyon formation. There's a lot of geological, the settling of sediments that we talked about in an earlier video with the 2-liter jug of different densities of materials is a great thing to describe what a big flood could do. And a lot of the things that we can see in the geology of our earth can be explained by that flood. So there's a lot of interesting material that I would recommend you take a look at, and a lot of commentaries that we could go into further. I believe we are out of time for our video today. Thank you for being with me, and we will meet again next week.